Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's 2023 Self-Nomination Data Validation and Qualified Clinical Data Registry Measure Submission Question and Answer session. Today's call will provide an opportunity for participants to answer questions about the Qualified Registry and Qualified Clinical Data Registry self-nomination process for the 2023 performance year of the Merit-Based Incentive Payment System. Now I'll turn it over to Sue Billett at CMS to begin.
Thank you, Mallory. And again, welcome to everyone attending today's Q&A session. Next slide. As a reminder, this is a standard disclaimer for all of our QCDR and Qualified Registry webinars. Please refer to the QPP website for any further questions. Next slide. Today, Anastasia will be reviewing self-nomination submissions. Stacy will be reviewing QCDR measures, and then Hector will be going over the resources available, which will lead us into the heart of today's webinar, the Q&A session. Again, welcome to everyone, and I will now turn it over to Anastasia.
Thank you, Sue. So for the purpose of today's call, there's just a few reminders we'd like to provide related to the self-nomination submission. So we'll move to the next slide and provide those reminders. So as a reminder, to be considered for the 2023 MIPS performance period, either current or prospective QCDRs and qualified registries do need to submit their completed self-nomination form, which will include the list of quality measures as well as potential QCDR measures and the data validation strategy that you intend to implement throughout the year. Please note that the deadline to submit that information is 8 p.m. Eastern Time on September 1st. Additionally, please note that you will not be able to successfully submit a self-nomination unless all required fields on each of the tabs have been filled out in its entirety. And then once that form is filled out in the entirety and all edits are finalized, you will need to click the Submit for Review button, which is actually on the lower left-hand side of the screen when you're in your self-nomination. Once you click that Submit for Self-Nomination button, or I'm sorry, Submit for Review button, then the self-nomination will come to the PIMS team for review. I will just note that please make sure you have all of your edits and all those required fields populated prior to submitting any of that for review. With that said, I will actually move the presentation over to our next presenter, Stacy.
Thank you, Anastasia. So we'll quickly touch upon a few reminders to help you with your 2023 self-nomination of QCDR measures. And after reviewing just a few slides, we'll then jump into the Q&A session. Next slide, please. Just a couple of high-level reminders to cover when you are submitting your QCDR measures. Excuse me. First is the ownership and eligibility of QCDR measures. We do receive a handful of questions every self-nomination about QCDR measure ownership. First and foremost, QCDR measures must be owned or co-owned by an approved and active QCDR for the applicable performance period. And if there's a QCDR measure that a QCDR would like to self-nominate, that is owned by another QCDR, the borrowing QCDR must receive the permission from the owning QCDR to be able to utilize that measure. And this permission and agreement is left up to the discretion of both of the involved QCDRs. And we do request that the permission is established prior to the time of self-nominating the measure, with this written proof of permission being submitted in the QPP self-nomination tool by the borrowing QCDR for CMS's review. And this would apply for any QCDR measures that are being utilized within traditional MIPS or as an MVP. Next slide, please. And lastly, just touch upon the transition to the MIPS value pathways or MVPs. For QCDR measures to be considered for an MVP, the following requirements must be met. The QCDR measure owner must self-nominate as a QCDR and submit the QCDR measure for CMS's consideration during the self-nomination period of July 1st to September 1st of the calendar year prior to the applicable performance period. The QCDR measure must be fully tested at the clinician level with the testing data received for review by the end of that self-nomination period, which is no later than September 1st. Only QCDR measures that are approved in the previous year will be considered for inclusion in the MVP. And lastly, candidate MVPs that do include QCDR measures are required to go through their proposed and finalized through the notice and comment rulemaking in order to be available for reporting in the upcoming performance period. And in instances where MVPs are finalized through the notice and comment rulemaking with QCDR measures, the applicable QCDR measures would then be eligible for a 2-year measure approval if finalized. And that's all I have for reminders. And now we'll turn it over to Hector Cariello with the PIMS team to go over some helpful resources. Hector?
Thanks, Stacy. Next slide. Just to quickly go over some resources as Stacy mentioned. Most of you are already familiar with the QPP website, as well as the QPP participation status lookup tool. And then there's also the MIPS Explorer measures and activities tool, the QPP resource library, which most of you again are very familiar with, as that's where we post the self-nomination resources and anything else related to intermediaries or our work, the QPP webinar library, the QPP help and support page, the QPP listserv. We highly encourage everyone to register or subscribe. It's available on the QPP website. And lastly, the calendar year 2022 physician fee schedule final rule for the QPP. We encourage you to get familiar with the rule. Right now, the 2023 rule is out, or the proposed rule is out. So once that's available, also that also can be used as a resource once the 2023 final rule is out. And next slide. If you'd like to contact the Quality Payment Program Service Center, you may do so at the phone or email address on the screen. To receive assistance more quickly, please consider calling during non-peak hours, which is between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Eastern. Emails must be sent directly, not forwarded or CC'd, and must utilize the QPP email address in the tool line. And inquiries forwarded or sent via email to the QPP with the QPP email address in the CC line will not trigger the creation of a case number for your inquiry. And to ensure that inquiries are routed to the appropriate subject matters, all inquiries must be submitted through the QPP Service Center and not the QCDR or Qualified Registry vendor support mailbox. Next slide.
We're now going to start the Q&A portion of the webinar. You can ask questions via the Q&A box or through the webinar audio. To ask a question via the webinar audio, please raise your hand and we will unmute your line so you can speak. It looks like we have a few questions already in the Q&A box, so we'll get started with those. The first question reads, in the self-nomination form, the proposed new MVPs are not available to select, as well as the proposed new adult immunization status measure is not available to select for support, as the QID is still TBD. Will there be a period to modify the self-nomination if the proposed MVPs are finalized?
Yeah, this is Hector from the PIMS team. So just like we've done in the last, I think, 2 or 3 years, you will have an opportunity to update the information, you will do so once we provide the qualified posting. And once the 2023 final rule is published and posted for QPP. So you can update that information there. And then what we usually do is either at the time that you update your qualified posting or before the start of the next self-nomination period, we go back and we update the self-nomination form. If your organization qualified for the simplified self-nomination form, we go back and we make sure that whatever's in the qualified posting matches what's in the self-nomination form. So again, you will have an opportunity to do so once the final rule is out for 2023. If your qualified posting has already been reviewed and finalized, we will send you another communication through the QPP self-nomination form website to give you an opportunity to update that information.
Thank you, Hector, for that response. The next question reads, how do we show transfer of ownership for a QCDR measure from one QCDR to another QCDR?
Hi, this is Olga from the PIMS team. So if a QCDR would like to transfer ownership to another QCDR, those arrangements are made between the QCDR themselves, and as Stacy mentioned, that must be in effect at the time of self-nomination. You would need to update the ownership of the QCDR measure in the QPP self-nomination portal. So if you have additional questions, specific questions on the required fields within the portal, then you can also always reach out to us by adding a comment, and then we can assist you if you need further clarification.
Thank you for that answer. We've had some more questions. So the next one reads, for APM wishing to report MIPS CQM, do we have to nominate ourselves and submit a qualified registry nomination? We don't want to partner with another QR vendor, but want to do the aggregation and submission ourselves.
This is Anastasia with the PIMS team. So if you are wanting to be a qualified registry to be able to submit your own data, that would include the data aggregation and submission of the data that you would be submitting for the purposes of your MIPS or APM reporting. You would need to submit the self-nomination and of course comply with all of the requirements set forth for the third-party intermediary qualified registries. On the other hand, I do know that for actual clinical entities like clinicians, groups, virtual groups, and so on, there are other ways for submission. So if for some reason you did not meet the qualified registry requirements or are not planning to be an official qualified registry, then I would certainly recommend submitting a ticket to the Quality Payment Program Service Center for additional information on how that information can be reported from the actual medical entity themselves.
Thanks, Anastasia, for that. The next question reads, the 2023 QPP proposed rule MRP proposals table document states that third-party intermediaries must support MVPs relevant to the specialties they support beginning with the 2023 performance year. Please explain precisely what is meant by support. Supporting any quality measures that are within the specialty-specific measure set, mentioning the specialty in the qualified registry clinical specialty self-nomination field, or something else?
Yeah, so I can start, and Anastasia, feel free to chime in. So by support, it means for that specific MVP that you select to support, that you're able to report those measures just like you do so in the self-nomination when you select the MIPS clinical quality measures, the ECQMs, the improvement activities, promoting interoperability measures and objectives. That's what support means, that you can support those measures and report those measures successfully on behalf of the clinicians, groups, virtual groups, and things like that. Mentioning it in the self-nomination form in the Qualified Registry or QCDR clinical specialties self-nomination field does not mean support. That's just information we also put in the qualified posting to let a potential clinician group, virtual group, and so on, to let them know what specialties your group, your intermediary organization supports, not so much the MVPs. This year, we will include a MIPS value pathways supported column in the qualified posting so that that information is also available. But again, by support, we mean that you are able to collect the data and submit the data.
And this is Anastasia. The only thing I was going to quickly caveat that with is just to add that if you are supporting an MVP, if one is, of course, related to the specialties you support, you would be expected to support all of the different components underneath that MVP. So it could be quality measures, promoting interoperability, improving activities, and so on. The one nuance just to kind of throw out there for everyone, as I know this has been a hot topic on other calls, is if you are a qualified registry, you are not able to support any QCDR measures. So if there are any QCDR measures within that MVP, then you as a qualified registry would not be expected to support those QCDR measures. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well, since it is a hot item that's been asked on many calls.
Thank you both for that answer. Just a reminder, you can submit questions via the Q&A box, or if you would like to ask a question live via audio, please raise your hand and we'll unmute your line and you can ask your question that way. We're going to turn back to the Q&A box for the next question, which reads, for QCDR measures that are nominated for the first time, what is the expectation for meeting the face validity? Are measures considered to have face validity on the fact that it went through a technical expert panel that includes clinicians, statisticians, documentation experts, and billing coding subject matter experts?
Hi, this is Olga again. So face validity for the measure assesses whether the measure is valid. There are several different ways that you can obtain this information. So for example, you can have measure scores and indicate whether scores can distinguish between good and poor quality. You can, mention whether the score is meaningful, understandable, whether the results can be understood by the intended audience. You can also have a technical expert panel or voting members, which provide their thoughts on the validity of the measure in a certain percentage as well. So that would be something that we would look at.
Thanks,
But
Olga.
we don't, just to add, we don't have a specific methodology or requirement. It would be up to the discretion of the measure owner.
Thanks, Olga, for that response to that question. We are out of questions right now in the Q&A box, so we'll just pause for a moment and we'll see if anyone else has any additional questions to submit, or if anyone would like to raise their hand and ask their question live. We're standing by ready to unmute, and we'll keep an eye on the Q&A box. Okay, it looks like someone has raised their hand. So Amanda Lord, we're going to unmute your line now and you can ask your question.
How about now? Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Cool. Anastasia, you know how you mentioned for MVPs that if there's QCDR measures in the MVP and we're supporting the MVP, that we don't necessarily have to support the QCDR measure. We're trying to be proactive and just get permission from the different QCDRs for the MVPs that exist now, right? So that we can report them all. Is there anything in place? I don't think there is, but what if some of the measures, the QCDR measures, to get permission for in the MVP are like, it's some exorbitant amount of money to be able to use the measures, like $20,000 for each measure. What do we do in that instance? Like, do we just, do we have to actually use the QCDR measures in the MVP if we're both a QCDR and a qualified registry, if they're like some ridiculous amount of money?
So I know that CMS definitely wants folks to be able to support all those QCDR measures. If for some reason you have attempted to use those QCDR measures, just like within any other case for the QCDR measures, if there's some type of reason as to why you are unable to support them, we would just request that you let us know as to why you're not, either maybe your request to support was rejected, or like you mentioned, the price is a bit steep or something to that effect. Let us know. That way we can just kind of keep track of that as well. And then if CMS has any concerns, we can certainly, open the dialogue up.
Okay, perfect. I'll shoot you guys an email of which measures we're talking about in which MVP so that it's clear. Thanks.
Yeah, and I would just throw it in your self-nomination. That way, we like to keep all of our communications tracked within those self-nominations. That way there's not just some communication via email, some within the self-nomination. We have, one consistent place for all of that communication that's back and forth.
Okay, so for the upcoming 2023 ones, any that we've gotten permission for the MVPs, we are going to add those in now in this self-nomination. Got it. Okay. And then any that we've gotten permission for, but that they've said, oh yeah, it's $25,000 per measure. I'm like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. So we can explain that in the self-nomination as well. Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Amanda, for your question. We're going to turn back to the Q&A box. And the next question reads, please clarify when third-party intermediaries could be expected from requirements to support IA and PI categories.
Hi, this is Hector. My understanding is that there's only an exception for promoting interoperabilities. I'm not sure about IA, but according to the rule, my understanding again is only that there's an exception to PI, and in the self-nomination form, you can let us know and provide the rationale as to why you're accepted from that, from supporting the promoting interoperability category. I believe we started asking that a couple of years ago, and last year we added a common field or a field within the self-nomination to provide that rationale.
Thanks, Hector, for that response. The next question reads, if you are a QCDR or you have to support the QCDR measures that fall into the MVPs you selected to support, or can you only support the ECQMs and CQMs?
If you select an MVP, you would need to report all the measures that fall under that MVP.
Thank you for that. The next question reads, I may have missed the previous MVP response, but if we added quality measures in our self-nomination to include all of the applicable MVPs for the QCDR, can these later be removed if the final rule determines we do not need to support all measures within that MVP? I ask because there are data updates required on our end if we are required to support these, but if we do not, we will pull these from our measure list.
This is Hector again. So you can update, you cannot update the self-nomination form itself, but you can update that information in the qualified posting if that's what's finalized in the 2023 final rule for the QPP. Again, we'll send you a draft qualified posting, and at that time you can make any updates. If the rule is already out, we'll also let you know what measures, whether they're quality measures, promoting interoperability, or improvement activities, were also removed because of what's been finalized in the rule. So when you get that draft qualified posting, you'll see that noted in there that we've removed certain things, measures and or activities from the qualified posting based on what was provided in the self-nomination form. And as I mentioned earlier, our process is either when the qualified posting is sent for your review, and if you make edits, we will update your self-nomination at that point for you, since the self-nominations lock at 8 p.m. on September 1st, or when we start preparing for the next self-nomination period. If you are an existing intermediary and you qualify for the simplified form, we will make sure that whatever's in your qualified posting, in your most current qualified posting, matches what's in your self-nomination form.
Thanks for that response. The next question is a follow-up question, which reads, "Hi, Anastasia, I have a follow-up question. On the 2023 MIPS self-nomination for QCDRs and QRs, it states, please note that eligible clinicians, groups, virtual groups, subgroups, and alternative payment model entities wishing to report for the 2023 MIPS performance period via the QCDR or Qualified Registry reporting mechanism don't need to nominate themselves. In your response, you said we need to nominate. Is that correct?"
This is Anastasia. So to follow up to that, this is kind of why I was trying to differentiate on the two different parts. So if you are an APM entity that wants to act as a qualified registry, then you would need to self-nominate. Now, that would mean that you would be a qualified registry. You would follow all, or I should say you would meet all of the requirements and follow all of the different deliverables or tasks that we require of our qualified registries. Now, that would only be if you want to actually act as a qualified registry. And you may or you may not. We have had medical systems and folks like that who do want to act as their own qualified registry so that they can do all of that work on their own behalf. On the other hand, we also at times, which is what this sentence is actually for, we actually sometimes have a, Dr. Smith or maybe a cardiology clinic that doesn't necessarily want to act as a qualified registry, but rather is just for some reason thinking they need to self-nominate. And so this is telling those folks that don't want to act as a qualified registry that they don't need to self-nominate. So it would really be up to your discretion as to how your organization would want to proceed in doing this. And that's part of why I suggested maybe submitting a Quality Payment Program Service Center case, just because we can walk through different scenarios, a little bit more of, what would have to happen if you were a qualified registry, what would you have to meet, what would you have to do, things like that. And then on the other end, because you are actually the APM, there's other options there that the folks at the help desk could walk you through. And so it would really be up to what you want to do is the essential answer. If you want to be a qualified registry, you would need to self-nominate. If you need other information regarding how to proceed, then the help desk would definitely provide some of that information to you and help you make that decision.
Thanks, Anastasia, for providing that clarification. Moving on to the next question, it reads, do we have to select MVPs in the self-nomination for becoming a registry for fiscal year 2023?
So the rule states that you have to support MVPs that apply to the clinicians, virtual groups, and so on that you support. However, if there is an exception for your organization to not support an MVP, then we ask you to please add a comment as part of our feedback, right? If you don't have it selected, we'll ask you to please select MVPs and update the MVP tab. But if the groups, clinicians or virtual groups and so on, or your clients that you support do not fit into any of the MVPs that have been finalized for 2023, then you can just add a comment, when you provide your feedback, or let us know of the updates that you've made, and just let us know as to why you are not required to support an MVP.
Thanks, Hector. The next question looks like it's a follow-up question from a previous question we had answered regarding the third-party intermediaries, expected requirement to support IA and PI categories. And the question reads, you're right, PI only, not IA. What's the criteria? For example, if it would be challenging to do the data validation for the PI category, would that count for the exception reason?
Hi, Hector again. So finding it challenging to do the data validation piece for the PI category would not qualify as an exception reason. The reasons that qualify, or the reason that qualifies, is, and this language is in the rule. I believe it's potentially also on our fact sheets, if I remember correctly. But for promoting operability, if the eligible clinician group, virtual group, or subgroup is using certified electronic technology, unless the third-party intermediaries, MIPS, eligible clinicians, groups, virtual groups, or subgroups fall under their reweighting policies. And you can find that information in the actual rule under the 414 section of the rule that's for the third-party intermediaries. But again, it's really if your clients fall under the reweighting policies. Again, finding it challenging to audit the PI category would not qualify as an exception.
Thanks, Hector, for that clarification and response. The next question reads, can you provide an example of a scenario where an external organization needs to be added as a partnership or collaboration?
This is Anastasia. You can take that one. So anytime you have a couple organizations coming together to complete the work or meet the requirements for a qualified registry or a QCDR, that partnership or collaboration must be noted within the self-nomination, and an agreement must be on file, a written agreement, I should say, is the way the regulation text works. But that signed written agreement should be in place by September 1st of that self-nomination timeframe. So for example, if you're self-nominating for 2023, then that agreement should be in place by September 1st of 2022. And again, we do understand that there may be different roles. For example, some QCDRs have a clinical partnership to meet the clinical needs of a QCDR. On the other hand, we have a lot of qualified registries as well as QCDRs that partner with technical platforms to either do some of the data related work, maybe data submission, data aggregation, maybe the data validation. Any of those type of partnerships or collaborations must be submitted on the self-nomination for that particular year.
Thanks, Anastasia, for that response. We do have a couple questions left. So just a reminder, you can submit questions via the Q&A box, or if you'd like to ask your question live, please raise your hand and we'll unmute your line. So the next question reads, so just to clarify, if we are a QCDR supporting all MVPs, we are indeed required to support all QCDR measures within the MVP, correct? And if we cannot support all of the QCDR measures in the MVP due to exorbitant price or fee for the QCDR measures, then we state that in the self-nomination. Also, does this mean we should have permission letters from all stewards that have QCDR measures in MVPs, correct? Or do we not need to support all QCDR measures in the MVP and we can just support all other measures in the MVP?
So the wording from the rule was really that everyone would support all measures, activities, and so on within that MVP. We understand that, based on some of the conversations that have been had, there has been some pushback or other reasons as to why some QCDRs may not be able to support those QCDR measures. If for some reason you are not able to support those QCDR measures for one reason or another, as I mentioned before, I'd recommend noting that within your self-nomination, and then we can certainly take that to CMS for further discussion to see if there's anything additional that needs to occur. But having that additional documentation, I think, is definitely helpful there. But yes, if for some reason you do have permission, the permission policy is very similar to how it is for any QCDR measures, in that if you're supporting a QCDR measure just in the traditional aspect, we'd request the permission to be uploaded, but that's the same for the MVP. We'll collect that permission information for any QCDR measures you support, regardless of supporting it for traditional MIPS or MVPs.
Thanks for providing that clarification. We have our next question is a follow-up question. Reading a follow-up question, the clinicians that we work do not plan on using MVPs next year. As per understanding, MVPs are still optional for clinicians. So would it be all right if we don't select any MVPs for the self-nomination? By selecting any MVPs, would that lead us to fail the self-nomination as a registry this year?
Yeah, so if the clinicians that you support or work with, if they qualify for an MVP that's finalized for 2023, then the understanding from the rule is that your organization will support the MVP. Now, whether or not those clinicians decide to report via the MVP, that's up to your clients, right? The clinicians that you're working with. But our understanding of the rule is that you do have to support the MVPs that your clients, do qualify for. And again, it's up to them whether or not they decide to report via the MVP option, just like with the clinical quality measures or ECQMs, right? You may support all of them, but at the end, your clients may really just, collect and submit data on, 10 of those measures.
Thanks for that, Hector. The next question is a follow-up question that reads, some of the answers about supporting MVPs don't quite sync up. Scenario, some of our clients are cardiologists. We intend not to support the related optimizing chronic disease management MVP. Instead, these clients will report through traditional MIPS. Is this acceptable to CMS?
Sorry, I couldn't get off mute. So again, I think it's the similar answer I just gave. It's really what's in the rule is you as an organization or as a third-party intermediary need to support those MVPs, whether or not your clients decide to report through the MVP option is up to them. You can always support traditional MIPS, which is what we have in the self-nomination form. You can also report through MVPs. At the end, it's the clients having the option for your clients to report those MVPs if those MVPs pertain to the clients that you're supporting or that have contracted with you. And again, if they decide not to report through the MVP route and they choose to go through traditional MIPS, it's really up to them.
Thanks, Hector, for that follow-up response. Just a reminder that you can submit questions either via the Q&A box, or if you would prefer to ask your question aloud, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll unmute your line and you can ask your question. We do have another question that has come through in the Q&A box. So it reads, another follow-up question. Why then is MVP optional collection type in the self-nomination form?
So the reason for that is because there might be a reason why your organization cannot support an MVP. I think I mentioned earlier on the call and clarified that if the clinicians you support, they do not qualify for any of those MVPs that are finalized for the given performance period, then that would be a reason as to why your organization cannot support or would not support MVPs. So that's why it's optional at this moment. And if that is the case, then we also ask that you provide that information to us and let us know as to why your organization cannot support MVPs at this time.
Thanks, Hector, for that response. We're going to take a brief pause. We don't have any questions in the Q&A box and no one has their hand raised. So if anyone does have a question they would either like to ask aloud, please raise your hand, or please submit your question in the Q&A box, and we will read them aloud. We'll just take a second and see if anything else comes in. So it does look like some questions are coming in the Q&A box. So the next question reads, how do we determine if our clinicians qualify for an MVP? I thought it was the clinician's choice if they decide to complete MIPS via MVPs next year. Our clinicians want to follow traditional MIPS next year. The problem we have with MVPs is that they have QCDR measures we don't support. So we won't be using MVPs at all next year. So selecting no MVPs during our self-nomination for becoming a registry, will that lead to a failed/rejected self-nomination for fiscal year 2023?
Yeah, so again, it is the clinician's choice. The rule states that the intermediary must support MVPs. The way that you would determine if your clinicians qualify for any of those MVPs is, I believe, would be the same process that you would follow if they qualify for the clinical quality measures, ECQMs, promoting durability measures, or improvement activities that they also would qualify for to submit. So I would encourage you to look at the MVPs that are finalized in the 2022 final rule, and then any that are finalized in the 2023 final rule, to see if any of those MVPs would potentially, your clinicians would potentially qualify for. Again, they do not have to submit via MVPs. The rule states that you as the intermediary must offer or support the MVPs. So if you select no as an MVP, we must have a reason as to why you cannot support the MVPs that are finalized for the given misperformance period. So if it's merely just because our clients are not going to report, I don't think that'll be an acceptable reason or exception for that. And I would assume that the self-nomination would be, you would be provided with that feedback asking as to why an MVP was not selected in the MVP tab or in the qualified posting under reporting options. And then we would ask you to clarify again. If you cannot support an MVP, we would ask again for the rationale as to why you cannot support it. It's really more so whether your organization can support it as opposed to whether your clients want to submit. Again, there are many intermediaries that support all clinical quality measures, but at the end of the day, the client, that client base only really reports 10. It's making those things available and then having the clients make the decision, or the clinicians make the decision as to how they want to report.
Thanks, Hector, for that.
Yeah, and just to clarify, sorry, Anastasia brought up a good point. If your organization in the self-nomination says that you support, that under your specialties, which specialties you support in the self-nomination field, if you select all specialties, I think if you select no MVPs, if you let us know that MVPs cannot be supported, then there might be a mismatch or a misalignment there in terms of saying you can support all specialties and then not being able to support at least one of the MVPs.
Thanks for that, and providing that extra information as well. The next question reads, I have not seen any verbiage in the rulings that vendors must support MVPs that are related to providers that we support. I have seen verbiage that we should support applicable MVPs. Can you share the specific verbiage you keep referring to as must/required?
Yeah, I don't have the actual rule citation. Again, it's in the final rule. Again, apologies for not having the exact citation right here offhand. since unfortunately I don't have all those pages memorized at the moment. But it is in the rule. And if I'm misspeaking, please feel free to correct me, send me the citation that you have for the rule, or send us the citation that you have, and we'll be more than happy to send an email correcting this information, or even putting it in the self-nomination forms and or on a monthly support call, letting folks know that, we spoke. And, again, my apologies if that's not the case. My understanding is that the intermediaries must support MVPs, regardless of whether their clinicians want to report via traditional MIPS, MVPs, APP, whatever the mechanism is.
And this is Anastasia. So while you were talking there, I jumped out into the rule stuff, so I can provide a little bit of information here. So within the ECFR, if you're reviewing that information, the citation is 414-1400 B1 and then II for 2 in Roman numerals. So it is out there. I will say the regulation text actually specifically says, beginning with calendar year 2023 performance period, 2025 MIPS payment year, QCDRs and qualified registries must support MVPs that are applicable to the MVP participant on whose behalf they are submitting MIPS data. QCDRs and qualified registries may also support the APP. Now, with that being said, subreg, there is additional information or additional clarification provided outside of that regulation text. So if you wanted to take a look at the 2022 final rule, and I was just about to it, for additional clarification related to why it says applicable to the MVP participant, that information you certainly can find on, let's see, volume 86 of the Federal Register, and you would see it on 65542. And then I believe it just goes on to the next, just the next, so 65543. So just those two. And then you'll find that information related to, CMS understands that if you are not supporting specific specialties that have a specialty specific MVP available, then you would not be able to support those MVPs. So that's the exception there.
Thanks for that, Hector and Anastasia. Just a reminder, if you would like to ask a question live, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll unmute your line, or you can write your question in the Q&A and I'll read it aloud to be answered. We do have another question that has come into the question box. So let's read that one next. It reads, if an external organization facilitates the transfer of data only, would they need to be included on the self-nomination as a partnership? Meaning, would we receive, store, calculate, validate, report feedback, and submit as a qualified registry?
This is Anastasia again. So if you are just collecting data from like one of your clients, for example, so some major health system is sending you all of this data, that would not necessarily constitute a participation or collaboration, that they're more of a client on you, or with you, I should say. With on the other aspect, though, if you have external organizations that participate with your organization to meet all of the requirements of a QCDR or qualified registry, whether it be data extraction, calculation, aggregation, validation, clinical needs for the QCDR measure, the QCDR definition requirements, those then would be a external organization. So if there are any type of organizations that are helping you do your work as a qualified registry or QCDR, you would need to list those as partnerships and collaborations.
Thanks for that answer. We do not have any more questions in the Q&A box, and no one has their hand raised right now. So we'll pause and see if anyone else submits questions or raises their hand. Reminder, you can either type your question in the Q&A box or raise your hand and we'll unmute your line and you can ask your question verbally. We did have another question come in the Q&A box, so I'll read that aloud. It says, so we are a QCDR for a specific specialty and there is not a relevant MVP for those providers. Is that enough reason to not support MVPs at this time? I feel like the language being cited is not direct.
Yes, that is sufficient. And you can put that in the self-nomination form. When you submit your self-nomination, you can add that as a comment, or when we review your self-nomination, if we notice that there is an MVP selected in the MVP tab, or that you do not have MVP selected under the qualified posting tab under the reporting options field, we will ask you why, and then you can also provide that information at that time as well.
Thanks, Hector, for that. Gonna pause again and see if any other questions come in or if anyone else raises their hand. Okay, it looks like another question has come in the Q&A box and it reads, quote, if a QCDR has contractors who created a measure calculation engine that is proprietary to their contracting company, do they need to be included in the self-nomination? In this scenario, we are using the proprietary software to help calculate measure performance, but they are contracted / hired by our QCDR.
This is Anastasia. We might need more information on this particular scenario in relation to how much, I guess, level of effort they're putting into that. If you've just, hired an EHR company or something to that effect, and you're using that software, but you yourself is the qualified registry, then, that might be a secondary thing, as that's an outside relationship and not necessarily doing something with the qualified registry. But if there's more additional work, like they're, having more of the day-to-day work within your qualified registry, measure interpretation, as well as that engine, things like that, then I think there may be some secondary questions there. The one thing I know when I get asked this a lot is part of why we request this information is because we understand that there might be multiple folks that are going in on this, and at times we have found extravagant amounts of inaccurate data, or we've had to file claims with the Office of Civil Rights for one reason or another, or there's something wrong there. When something goes down like that, it could be that, we've got clinicians complaining and they're filing things, or, something that we have to do on our end. It is ultimately the qualified registry that's going to be at fault. So if for some reason something happens and we have to alert somebody for some reason, it would be your qualified registry and your qualified registry alone that would be at fault and ultimately responsible for whatever the issue is. What we've found is sometimes, we might have ABC QCDR who has all of those issues, and while they're the QCDR, so again, ultimately they're the ones at fault for whatever may have happened, we find out on the back end that, it looks like there's a couple different organizations. They had a technical platform doing the calculation, or they had somebody doing the data submission and something didn't happen wrong. And so the blame ultimately tries to get shifted on someone else, but it is the responsibility of the qualified registry to make sure all of that information is coming in true, accurate, complete, meeting all of the requirements, all of that kind of stuff. So when you're partnering with anybody to make sure that you meet the requirements of a qualified registry, complete any of the actions required by a qualified registry, all of those entities should be noted within the self-nomination. That way, all those folks can be taken into consideration if there are any issues, but also, sometimes folks will like to have both names on qualified postings and things like that for publication purposes.
Thanks, Anastasia. And it looks like there was a little bit more added after I read that initial question, kind of a little bit more information. It states we are a rural independent hospital that has contracted use of their EMR. They currently supply our files for traditional MIPS submission and have indicated they do not intend to support MVP reporting. Do they have any requirement to support MVPs? Do they need self-nominate and then support MVPs?
So if they were wanting to be a qualified registry or QCDR, they would have to self-nominate and they would be required to support MVPs. I will note, I'm just trying to find my screen, that I have the regulation text up on here too, that I believe, and I'm just double checking, this call is specific, of course, to QCDRs and qualified registries. But in addition to that, kind of separate from this call, health IT vendors that are submitting data outside of the QCDR qualified registry realm are also required to support MVPs as well. So there's some requirements, and again, this isn't necessarily that call, so I'm not going to delve into that too much, but they are required to support MVPs as well. So there definitely may be some things that they need to look into, but it would really be up to what they're doing as a QCDR or qualified registry, if they would want to be one, as to what that is. And since they are, it sounds like, creating the measure submission files and things like that, that would be an organization that would need to be included as a partnership.
Thanks, Anastasia, for that response. We appreciate everyone submitting their questions and taking the time out of their day to attend this webinar. I will pass it back to Sue to conclude.
Thanks, Mallory. I hope everyone found this webinar to be both beneficial and educational. I know myself, I inevitably think of a question as soon as the session ends. So please feel free to contact us as outlined in these slides for any further insight or clarification. On behalf of all the speakers and the panelists today, we thank you for attending and wish you much success in the 2023 self-nomination process. Have a wonderful day.